In this lesson, we'll be adding some toolbar buttons in the iTwin viewer using the UI items provider interface. Let's take a look at a preview of what our toolbar button will look like. And this is where it will be located at the very top left corner in the top left region, commonly known as the manipulation tools area. And it's going to go at the very bottom of the vertical list, labeled as toggle walls tool. So on toggle, it will hide and display our walls, just like that. Before we start the toolbar implementation, let's learn a little bit about the UI items provider on our documentation. UI items provider are classes and interface used for specifying UI items to be provided at runtime. And they're used to insert toolbar, status bar, backstage items, and widgets to our viewer. We'll primarily focus on the provide toolbar buttons items in this lesson. So let's go there to the UI items provider interface. Under interfaces, UI items provider, and you'll notice the provide toolbar button items is described as the UI items manager calls the following method to get items to populate specific toolbars and takes it four mandatory arguments: the stage ID, the stage usage, the toolbar usage, and the toolbar orientation, and returns an array of common toolbar items. We'll go over these parameters as we start implementing the provide toolbar button items functionality. Let's go back to our code and start implementing the UI items provider interface. We'll first start by creating a new directory under source called providers. And in this directory, I'll name a new file called smart device UI items provider.tsx. Again, we'll first start by importing the UI items provider interface from our package at Bentley UI abstract. This is the UI items provider that we'll be implementing. A small correction here, and as a reminder, with the latest release, our packages are no longer prefixed with @Bentley. The package here should be called @iTwin/appui-abstract. For future reference, all @Bentley packages will start with @iTwin from here onwards, and most iModel.js dash names will instead be replaced with core dash. Going into our declaration, we're going to export the class called smart device UI items provider and have it implements the UI items provider interface. You'll notice that it complains that the property ID is missing. This ID is a mandatory property that we need to define in the interface. So let's declare our public read-only ID to be smart device UI provider. And this just helps us identify which provider will be providing the toolbar buttons. So let's start implementing our provide toolbar button items function. And to make things easier, I'm just going to go right to our documentation page, copy the signature, go to back to our code, paste that right in. This arrow should be a return type common toolbars, close the bracket, and finally import our types. So toolbar usage, toolbar orientation, and the common toolbar item. You'll notice VS Code is complaining about us not returning an array of common toolbar items, so let's just return an empty array for now. I'll call this variable const toolbar button items, and it's going to be of type common toolbar item, an array initialized to an empty array, and for now let's just return the toolbar button items to remove that issue. The provide toolbar button items function is called once as soon as the provider is registered to the viewer, and we need to check for a few things like stage usage, toolbar usage, and toolbar orientation to let the provider know where we'll be adding our buttons. So let's perform this check with an if statement. If the stage usage is the stage usage.general area. This is the default stage when we first opened the viewer, and if we're creating the toolbar button for content usage manipulation, this is the type of function our button will be providing. And one more check, if the toolbar orientation is set to toolbar orientation dot vertical. And we're going to attach this to the left side of our user interface, and it's going to go down in the toolbar list, so we'll set that to vertical. Close if statement. Just to get a better understanding of where our conditional statement actually is, we'll alt tab back to our application, and you'll notice this vertical toolbar. This is attached to our general stage area, the default stage, and is responsible for content manipulation that can alter and change the look of our viewer. So we'll be adding it right under here as the last button in our vertical toolbar. So going back to our code, the toolbar button that we'll be creating will be a toggle to display or hide our walls. We've covered how to hide walls in chapter visualization, so please refer to that video if you've forgotten or haven't covered that chapter yet. I'm going to start by creating a new const variable called toggle walls button, and set it to toolbar item utilities, which is a class that contains a function to help create our toolbar items called create action button. And all this function does is it creates an action button with 5 parameters, which are all mandatory. The ID, just a string, and it is a unique identifier in the case you want to refer to this item in a different provider. The item priority, which is a number and determines the order of where we'll place it in the vertical toolbar. An icon, it should be a string or a conditional string value. We have a lot of built-in icons you can choose from. A label, which describes the action of the button, which we get when we hover over the toolbar button. And also an execute function, which gets called when we click on the button itself. So let's start passing in our parameters. Again, the first parameter is the ID. I'll ID this as toggle walls. The item priority, I'll give this a number of 1000, just a really high number to get it to the bottom of the list. Next, our icon string. What I like to do is go to our node modules, add Bentley packages, and we have a built-in package here called icons generic. We have a list of SVGs you can choose from. I'm going to be choosing the element SVG, and if you're using the preview SVG extension, you can see the icon here. So I'm going to stick with the element.svg, go back to our file, and all of our icons must have a prefix icon dash and then the name of the file element as the icon image. Next, our label. Our description, I'm just going to put this as toggle walls tool. And finally, the most important, the execute function, which defines what our function will do on click. And that's it. So our button will call the hidehouse exterior function in our visualization class. So let's start by importing that. Visualization from /visualization file. Go back down and let's call that now visualization hidehouse exterior, and it takes in a single argument, the viewport, and we can access that using iModel add view manager selected view. Now remember that this function only hides the walls currently. We need to reverse the hide if this button is a toggle to turn on and off the hide feature. So let's pass in an additional argument and call it this._toggle walls. Toggle walls will basically serve as our Boolean flag, so every time we click on the toggle walls button, it needs to invert. So let's do that right before the function call. This._toggle walls will be set to the inverse of itself. So from true to false and false to true. Finally, let's declare that as a class variable. Call it private_toggle walls, and this will be of type Boolean. Now we need to redefine the hidehouse exterior function. So let's jump back into our visualization file and add an additional parameter, call it toggle. This will be optional, just so we don't need to alter the existing calls to hide house exterior and of type Boolean. Now let's add a check. If the variable toggle exists, we'll call vp.changeCategory display of toggle, else just call the default behavior, which just sets it to false. The final thing we need to do is initialize our toggle. So going back to the Smart Device UI Items provider, we'll need to initialize this to false since our walls initially starts hidden. And that's it for our toggle walls button. Just pass this into the toolbar buttons items now by using push toggle walls button, and that's it. We finally need to register our Smart Device UI Items provider to the iTwin viewer. So jumping back to app.tsx, we'll start by importing the items provider. So from /providers/Smart Device UI Items provider, import our Smart Device UI Items provider class, and jumping all the way down again, we'll need to pass an additional prop to our main viewer component. It's going to be called the UI providers prop, and this just takes an object of arrays of all our UI providers. So we'll call the new Smart Device UI Items provider constructor, and that should do it. Let's save all our files and check out our new button in the browser. So you'll now notice a new toggle. It says toggle walls tool, and just to give you a better look, it starts out as hiding all the walls, and we'll hit it and it should now display the walls. And it should do the opposite if I give this another click, and there you have it. You now learned how to add a toolbar button, and in the next lesson, we'll add a widget to our user interface so we can get a list of all our smart devices at a glance.